Zdravstvuyja, and welcome again to what is our episode 6 of my Soviet Union vlog. Today we are looking at terror, and in particular terror under Lenin and Stalin. This is a strand that crops up both in theme 1 and theme 3. So theme 1 is all about governments of the Soviet Union, and there it would crop up more as a kind of comparison between the ways in which Lenin and Stalin ran the countries, the nature of their communist government. So we'll reflect a little bit on that and on the differences between them. But then also, more importantly, in theme 3, which is all about control of the Soviet Union, it would focus more there on how conformity is enforced by Lenin and Stalin. And there it would be more likely to come up as a cause, part of a cause question, perhaps comparing it to things like the media. We've talked a little bit about monopolization of the media under Lenin, religion, propaganda, or cultural change. So let's talk about the terror first of all, and then we'll reflect a little bit upon those two questions. So the first thing to know actually is that, of course, even before the communists took control of Russia, the Soviet Union as it becomes, in 1917, they were used to, as a country, having a secret police. The Tsar had a secret police, and the what becomes the KGB, the Cheka initially, fulfill that role in a similar way. That's not to excuse it, but there is a cultural context there for it. So straight away in December 1917, when Lenin creates the Cheka, he's not creating it kind of in a historical vacuum. It's put under the leadership of Felix Dzerzhinsky, and the Cheka are given unlimited powers of arrest, detention, and torture, which they use in an arbitrary way. And by arbitrary, I mean that it's not. There's not a particular. There are targets, obviously, but it's not a particularly. There's not a process that's followed through. It's used in an indiscriminate way. This terror, or this use of terror, was justified initially by the crisis of the Civil War, and in the context, as I've said, also of Tsarist brutality, but also of white brutality during the Civil War. So it felt like kind of everybody's being violent, and the Bolsheviks were just one group being violent and tyrannical within that context. See if you buy that later on. They are the group responsible in July 1918 for the execution of the Romanov family, the Tsar and his family. Some people see the attempted assassination in August 1918 of Lenin himself by a lady called Fatia Kaplan as being a trigger for an expansion of terror. And in part it was, well, it's hard to tell really whether that's the actual cause of it or just kind of coincidental and that it would have happened anyway. Between 1918 and 1920, numbers vary, but between 200,000 and 300,000 people were executed. And by Lenin's death in 1924, 315 labour camps had already been set up, gulags, which housed mostly white prisoners of war, kulaks, wealthier peasants who were not cooperating with the Bolsheviks, real kulaks, and political prisoners from groups like the SR. There'd also been a series of show trials in 1922 for leading members of political parties and the higher hierarchy of the Moscow clergy. Lenin, in fact, said himself that the court is not to eliminate terror, but to legitimize it. In other words, to provide the backing for the Cheka that was required. So all this to say, if we're thinking about what changes between Lenin and Stalin, the answer is not that Stalin introduces terror. Terror was already there before, and it was already a legal part of the communist government. They've legalized it, and it was seen as a legitimate tool in their arsenal for getting control of the country. In that sense, what Stalin does is he continues with Lenin's use of terror. He continues the methods of terror, gulags, executions, show trials, and he has a similar goal, getting control of the country, but that control of the country is now more about Stalin's control of the country rather than the Communist Party's control of the country. And he has other aims as well. Stalin's aims are also, I would say, linked in with his paranoia. much more so than Lenin. He has a feeling that people are after him where it's not really proven. Whereas in Lenin's case, in 1917 to 1921, there was a civil war going on. People really were trying to remove the Communist Party from government, remove him, therefore, from government. And there'd been that assassination attempt on him in August 1918. So there's a bit more legitimacy, perhaps, to the rationale, at least, for terror under Lenin. Whereas with Stalin, it's a bit more preemptive, at least, let's say. Also, Stalin uses terror as a way of identifying scapegoats for the frailties of his early 5-year plans. Kulaks, wreckers, saboteurs and Nepmen are targeted in the early 30s. And there becomes an increasing economic role to the terror. Gulag inmates, prisoners, are used for their economic value, and there are records of engineers actually being targeted in the terror because they would be useful in projects that the gulags are working on. So a really good one, a really good example of that is the White Sea Canal. Over 10,000 prisoners died. It was constructed almost entirely by Gulag slave labour. And of course, it turns out to be too shallow to be usable by sea ships. But nevertheless, the White Sea Canal is an example of where the Gulags were contributing. I mean, that continues. There were 2 billion rubles brought into the Soviet economy in 1937 by the Gulag, and that rises to 4.5 billion rubles by 1940. So it's already substantial before the war, and during the war it becomes even more important. By the 1950s, over a third of the gold and a lot of the timber and coal produced by the Soviet Union is being produced through the Gulag system. So just to summarise there, that Lenin and Stalin share methods and some goals and um, uh, the justification of terror, but they differ in the well, in some of their motivations. Lenin has a more economic, sorry, Stalin has a more economic motivation, and Lenin less so. Lenin's more about just getting control of the country. Stalin's more about getting control for himself, and then also, of course, Stalin differs in the scale and scope of his terror, and probably in the brutalization of his terror too. So this starts in 1932, 1933, arguably, with the Red Army sealing the border to Ukraine, where there was a famine going on. And during that time, the Soviet Union continues to export grain to try and finance its shift to industrialization. But at that time, people are starving in the Ukraine. About 4 to 5 million people starve. Again, you see various numbers, but that seems like a fairly conservative estimate, if anything. And during the early years of the terror, 15 million kulaks are victimized. As I said already, wreckers, saboteurs, and spies are selected and put on trial. Nepmen, bourgeois experts are picked out. And this is the early use of terror to provide, as I said, scapegoats for where things go wrong in the economic planning, so that Stalin doesn't have to admit that there are problems with industrialization. However, the main thing that we think about in terror is from the sort of mid to late 30s, where terror initially is targeted on the party and then moves through being targeted on the whole population and finally upon the armed forces. So in 1934, the Cheka had already changed names to the OGPU, and it changed names again to the NKVD. In 1934, the NKVD was formed actually by the OGPU, secret police, merging with the Interior Ministry and picking up a larger role, therefore. We also think of the murder, assassination of Sergei Kirov in 1934 being key to this. Sergei Kirov had been someone who stood against Stalin at the party conference. Well, stood against, perhaps say it stood alongside Stalin, but had been voted for and seemed to be more popular and more trusted, perhaps, by the Communist Party than Stalin. And he was then murdered in mysterious, dodgy circumstances in 1934. Now, whether or not Stalin knew about this or had ordered the murder really is a moot point. What he does do is exploit it amazingly. And 30 to 40,000 party members are exiled within months. And within a year, almost 18% of the Communist Party had been removed. It also triggers a series of show trials. In 1936, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Tomsky are put on trial in the trial of 16, obviously along with 13 others. This is the first time that the show trial has been used on communist leaders, and that's followed up in 1937 with allies of Trotsky like Radek and Pyatakov, and then in 1938 with Bukharin and Rykov, the last of those who had been close to Lenin. So Stalin uses this as an opportunity to remove all the other leaders that could threaten his position, starting perhaps with Kirov, but certainly working through all those other leading communists. And ultimately ending up with the trial of Trotsky in absentia in 1940, and then his murder in exile in Mexico. So that's the trial, the terror, rather focusing on the party. 1937, 1938, the Yezhovshchina expands terror out to being targeted on the whole of the Soviet Union, or potentially on the whole of the Soviet Union. In fact, there'd only been just over 1,000 deaths in 1936. And I've seen it written somewhere that actually that the terror from 1934 to 36, in terms of victims, is probably no more severe than terror under the Tsar. But 1937, 1938, there are at least 650,000 members, Russian citizens, who die in the terror, and probably a lot more. And the key shift is that it's now not just party members, but ordinary citizens who are at risk. That said, manual workers and women, who only made up 5% of the population, of the terror victims, were a lot safer than other members of Russia, and large swathes of rural Russia weren't even touched by the terror at all. In fact, even Leningrad in 1937, only 0.6% of the population were terror victims, either being shot or exiled. But if you were an urban educated manager or a professional, kind of middle-aged, 30 to 45, you were extremely vulnerable. And nevertheless, 650,000 people, even with a country as large as Russia, is a lot of people to be exiled or shot, executed in just 2 years. Even worse than that, in 1937, the NKBD had an order 00447, which ordered an arbitrary arrest quota of 259,450 people. Now, this was just a number that was made up and put out to say that this is how many people you need to arrest this year on suspicion of plotting against the Communist Party and against Stalin in particular. 28% of that 259,000 were to be shot, and the rest should be given 8 to 10 years in the camps. It was left to local officials to fulfill that quota as they saw fit. And actually, in that atmosphere in the Soviet Union, many of those quotas were over-fulfilled, as people didn't want to end up on Stalin's bad side, understandably. The point here is that the terror is not now looking for people who, even proactively looking for people who might be plotting against Stalin. It is now just about spreading the idea to people that they should not even think about acting against Stalin and his government. This spreads out even to the armed forces, and in 1938-39, the Red Army, which had been, of course, reconfigured by Trotsky during the Civil War, and therefore could be seen as being loyal to Trotsky. Nevertheless, an army would have been useful in retrospect, in the build-up to the Second World War. However, 3 out of 5 marshals in the Red Army, 14 out of 16 army commanders, and 37,000 army officers are all executed in those last couple of years before the Second World War started. Finally, the terror started to wind down and becomes actually even focused upon the NKBD itself. Thousands of NKBD members were killed. You see varying figures on this as well, and including Yagoda, the leader of the NKBD in the mid-30s. He's executed in 1938. And then Yezhov, who had overseen the last expansion phase in 1939. In fact, he is accused, somewhat ironically, of excesses by Stalin. There is some truth in that, probably, that Yezhov was trying to anticipate what Stalin would be pleased by and was taking things on his own initiative. But nevertheless, Stalin clearly knew what was happening and could have reined him in. So, just to recap, then, what we've got here is the use of the widespread use of terror and brutality in controlling the Soviet Union. Under Lenin, it's I'd never say it's necessary, but a slightly more perhaps desperate measure to try and grab control of the country on behalf of the Communist Party. But then it becomes more about grabbing control and securing control on behalf of an individual under Stalin. The methods are similar, but the scale is much bigger and more widespread under Stalin. The causes of power are also similar, but again, they expand under Stalin to include economic and morale, scapegoating uh, requirements as well. So I hope that's useful, and I'll see you next time.